right, welcome to the Redefine Tomorrow 2026. You're here with me with topics for today is the digital asset risk in production, composability, resilience, and supervisory-grade monitoring. My name is Rob. I'm a Chief Investment Officer at Token X. So please be welcome, Mr. Nikos, who is the CEO and founder of the Metrika. Please just say hi to the audience, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So before we jump to into topic, like a Token X, we were found like 5 years ago. And when we talk about digital asset at risk, and I think it is unavoidable, and we are very concerned about it. So I believe that Metrika, you guys has a pretty longer journey than us. So I would like you to maybe summarize about what is Metrika doing as your journey and what's the position of the Metrika in the digital market.
Yes, thank you, Wanrub. We started Metrika 6 years ago, and Metrika was started at the time when the third generation of the blockchain networks was coming out. So if you consider Bitcoin the first generation, Ethereum the second, then there was like the third EVM compatible type of blockchains out there. Those were the ones that were promising higher performance, surpassing Visa level transactions. And at that time, it became apparent. And when we started, we were doing blockchain health analysis of the networks, helping the teams building those networks launch and scale their networks. So that was kind of what Metrika started building, and is kind of at its core DNA over the first 3 years. And then as crypto winter happened in the market, we found, I would say, the perfect opportunity to kind of go from the protocol ecosystem into the financial institutions. It was actually a pull from financial institutions where they came to us and said, you guys are the best at understanding the underlying health of the blockchain networks. And this is important financial market infrastructure for us. And it's important when we provide custody of ETH, of Bitcoin, of other native tokens. We need to understand the health of the networks. And we started understanding that operational risk was something that was directly tied to the analytics and the health visibility that we had into those networks. Over time, with very large GSIBs and financial institutions, we started understanding risk frameworks. We started understanding the need for continuous risk monitoring, for risk evaluations. We started understanding the requirements by SEC, by CFTC, by OCC. And therefore, today, fast forward, we work with the leading GSIBs and financial institutions where we operationalize their risk frameworks. We provide them with risk assessments, risk reporting, continuous risk monitoring, severity tagged risk events, workflows on top of that, so that they can operationalize and provide in a safe manner either their custody services or their tokenization initiatives or their stable coins or tokenized assets.
Oh, thanks very much for sharing. I mean, you look covering like so many areas in the digital asset. And since you have spent years looking at digital assets as a live system rather than just tradable instruments, so what goes wrong the moment a risk team insists on seeing the multiple price positions on counterparties?
Yeah, I think the mistake that the common mistake when you look at this from a high level is that you're assuming that digital assets behave like traditional financial instruments, where the primary risks are price, counterparty, market exposure. But in reality, many of the largest financial losses in the market originate from operational governance, infrastructure failures. That traditional financial risk frameworks were never designed, to continuously monitor. So it's a different thing when you think about a traditional asset that sits within the four walls of a financial institution and where there is a counterparty where it trades. and it's a 9 to 5 market versus kind of a natively issued asset on a blockchain that depends on the blockchain as a financial market infrastructure and is 24/7 continuously traded. So I think the very common mistake there on price is that the financial risk metrics and the price covers the spectrum of the risk versus like in these newer technologies where infrastructure plays a critical role, that risk is simply not captured. And I would say that price and market exposure is a derivative measure of those risks when they get manifested.
Oh, you provide kind of a traditional finance concept that's very interesting. But if traditional finance risk frameworks were built to monitor firms and exposures, so what will be the first thing they fail to see when the object being monitored is a composable, is software-driven network?
Yeah, I think that, as you said before, the traditional risk frameworks were built, around counterparties and firms and financial exposures. They were never really built to capture the underlying technology infrastructure. And today, that becomes a core part of the enterprise risk surface. In many ways, this reminds me of cyber risk, the way it was treated years ago. For many, many years, cyber risk was treated as a very niche IT issue sitting outside the mainstream enterprise risk framework. Over time, institutions realized that cyber risk was not just kind of a technology IT problem, but it was an operational resilience, financial stability issue. And obviously, regulators recognized that, and the board recognized that. So today, cyber risk is a core part of the enterprise risk framework. So, in a similar way, the digital asset infrastructure is today not being taken. Like the first reaction is that digital asset infrastructure, it's yet another asset class. But the reality is that the digital asset infrastructure and blockchain is a core component of the operational risk. So you need to know about the validators you have, the level of decentralization, the smart contracts, the governance systems, the bridges, the APIs, the oracles, and any dependencies that you have, which are becoming part of the financial system itself. I think what was innovation risk before is now becoming core operational risk. And I think the traditional risk frameworks need to get adapted to this reality. In many cases, this can be a pretty long journey for some financial institutions where they start from their traditional enterprise risk framework, and then they need to understand how to derive a digital asset risk framework and incorporate the infrastructure. Sometimes you see very well-known consulting firms helping along this journey. In some other cases, there are industry initiatives like the GBBC RMF, where we are a participant there, where they're trying to set a standard and allow for a publicly available risk framework to educate the market. So this is, I think, kind of the gap that today needs to be filled between the traditional risk frameworks and the evolution of them into the digital asset space.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a concept, and you mentioned a little bit about composability. Right? So I would say that people often talk about composability as an innovation and efficiency, which I think is it. Right? But in your viewpoint, when does it stop being a feature and start becoming like a hidden dependency problem?
Composability is a great thing, right? Composability sits at the center of the innovation here, but it does a couple of things, right? It increases the speed at which your asset gets exposed to new DeFi services or other kind of networks, and that means that you start having a visibility issue on the types of risks that each layer of composability is adding to the problem. And also because of the nature of the atomic settlements and the instant propagation of risk across the layers of composability, you are exposed to that now in real time. So you have many different layers that you don't have sufficient visibility into the types of risks that those carry, but also you have the instant propagation of risk when things go wrong. So I think the question on the hidden dependency is understanding what's behind each layer of the composability that you're introducing. And I'm sure, one of you've seen it in tokenized assets, for example. If you
Yeah.
start exposing those tokenized assets into DeFi protocols, and those DeFi protocols interact with other DeFi protocols,
Yep.
if we live in a world where these are regulated services and there is responsibility and regulatory requirement on someone being responsible, you need to understand what you are exposing your assets to. So you need to have a risk framework that says, I'm going to be exposing my tokenized asset to this DeFi protocol. What are all the risks that I need to consider from this kind of DeFi protocol, and measure that risk? Because obviously this is not kind of the counterparty risk. To the extent that this is a decentralized financial service, the risk is on you, on understanding what you're exposing your asset to. So that means that you need to understand, the cloud providers. You need to understand what's the governance structure of that community. What are the dependencies in terms of liquidity or any other kind of factors? What are kind of the validators? What's the concentration that you're looking at? So you need to go through a very thorough risk framework, as if you were onboarding kind of a vendor, but onboard the DeFi protocol in a similar manner. And once you do that, you need to understand what are the key risk indicators where things can go wrong, what are the scenarios, what are the severity tagged risk events, and what are my controls and mitigation strategies when those things happen. If you look at the Kelpo incident, for example, there was a 40-plus-minute window over which somebody who had the regulatory responsibility, and in this case, there wasn't regulatory responsibility, but if this were institutional, there would be a 40-minute window over which you could have taken actions.
Mm.
So in that window, all of these controls that would have been designed, to the extent that they were effective in covering that range of risks, they would have taken effect. And I think this is kind of what we need to understand in terms of like how to treat composability. I don't think the solution is inducing delays or making things less efficient. I think we need to manage kind of the risks around it.
Mm. Oh, I see. Do you think what kind of the dependency chains in the digital assets are most dangerous precisely because they don't look dangerous at the first glance?
Yeah, I think some of the most dangerous things are the indirect dependencies. For example, a stablecoin may depend on bridges, Oracle infrastructure, validator coordination, governance, multi-sigs, cloud infrastructure, or external liquidity venues that might seem operationally separate but are very tightly coupled under stress.
Mm.
So these chains, often look manageable in normal conditions, but you only kind of understand, that coupling between those factors when they're during disruption.
Mm. I got you. Uh, Maybe let's move to the next question. A lot of monitoring in this market still looks like a sophisticated observation rather than like the operational intelligence. My question is, what is the difference between, a dashboard that just only informs and monitoring system that actually change the outcomes and the stress?
Yeah, so there are lots of dashboards, right? The question is not about just looking at metrics. What you need is, what are the types of risks? What's the risk framework? And how can I answer those questions and quantify the risks that I'm facing? And if those risks manifest, what are the different bands of those risks? What are the thresholds that can happen based looking historically across them? And then, even more importantly, what's the action and what's the control on those risks? So my point here is that this is not just about looking at data and just doing research or informing yourself. This is also useful, but for the context of updating your risk frameworks with anything that you might be missing. But it needs to start with what is the risk framework that captures the risk posture that I want to have, that makes me compliant over the jurisdictions that we are licensed to operate. And then how do I take this framework and does that adequately cover the type of activities and the type of use cases, whether it's custody is one thing, tokenization is a different thing. Like, does it capture the risks of the underlying activity that I'm licensed to provide? And then what are really the controls that I need to put in place so that the risk, the severity tagged risk events can actually become actionable?
Thank you very much. Oh, I think the topics today is very heavy, so many risk topics, right? But, like if a protocol or an asset or kind of ecosystem is becoming like institutionally fragile, uh, what is it the kind of signal you want to catch before the market has designed and there is a problem?
Well, one of the things that, based on our experience, we like to look at is any deterioration in governance and operational coordination before we see any effect on the price. In software-driven financial infrastructure, as you mentioned, changes in contributor alignment, governance disputes, or even turnover among key engineers of a project in major upgrades, for example, can become important resilience signals. For example, in recent public discussions, there is a governance. There have been public discussions that were debating what's the governance direction within the Ethereum ecosystem. And for example, one thing we do, like on our platform, is we do adverse media monitoring, and we're picking up a signal that there are a number of engineers in the Ethereum Foundation that have resigned, and as a result, the pending upgrade, the next upgrade on the Ethereum, might have an impact or might have a delay. So this is kind of a risk signal in terms of governance, and it's a risk signal that translates into operational risk when it comes to kind of one of the major one of the upgrades, which is an operational incident, an operational event. So these are kind of the things that we look at, right? And I think these are some of the early signals that you can see in terms of like how does the community sometimes, like on X or Twitter, you can look at how people are reacting to certain aspects, and that can also be an early signal that might be very interesting when combined afterwards with key risk indicators on the network or on the governance process.
I see. When we talk about the risk, so I'm thinking about the one word about the visibility. I can share this in the token X. We have our own blockchain, like an EVM compatible also, and we provide the chains to the tokenization service to our clients who would like to be the issuer of the tokens. Right? So my digital asset teams, often say they want the full visibility, even the technology risk, a compliance risk, a project risk, a due diligence risk. Right? But in practice,
Correct.
too much signal can be as dangerous as too little. My question is how you decide what actually matters enough to rise from the telemetry into the action.
Yeah. So first of all, it's not up to Metrika to decide what signals are important or not. In the sense that this has to do with the risk appetite of the financial institution, which is reflected into the risk framework, but also into the calibration of the risk framework that reflects the risk appetite that they're taking across certain dimensions of risk. I agree with you. Not every signal deserves escalation. The key here is for a financial institution to internally determine what is relevant in terms of their operational resilience, their compliance obligations, their financial exposure, and governance requirements. So ultimately, what we need to make sure from the Metrika side is that we have all the risk signals and that we provide the functionality so that the financial institution can reflect the importance of that signal and the types of actions that they want to take.
Well, I see. I think we see the same point about the metrics, about the signal, and all about everyone want the full visibility. But yeah. Next one, it may be like, when the resilience fails in the production. It's the real problem. Usually, the system itself, the dependency graph around it, or maybe the human organization that is supposed to interpret and act on the warning.
Usually, I think it's the interaction between all three that you mentioned, like the system itself, the dependency graph around it, and the organization responsible for interpreting the signals and responding. And I think, a good example might be, the Terra ecosystem collapse. There were structural weaknesses in the stabilization mechanism itself. There were hidden dependencies on market confidence and external liquidity. And there were governance assumptions around how participants would behave under stress. So none of those elements alone necessarily caused, the collapse, but together they amplified the fragility very quickly. So in practice, I think resilient failures in digital assets are rarely isolated to kind of, just technical failures. They're usually cascading failures across technology, dependencies, incentives, and organizational response.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, let's move to the last word, of this session is a composability, resilience, and the last one is supervisory-grade monitoring. Oh, I love this word, but because this word sounds strong. But what does it actually require before a regulator or a CRO or a serious institution should trust it as a part of a real risk program?
Yeah, I think the word monitoring doesn't do this justice, right? Supervisory grade to me means that it's a lot more than just visibility into what's happening on the blockchain, right? It is a system that institutions can operationalize consistently within their risk program, which means explainable methodologies, evidence-based key risk indicators, KRIs, calibrated thresholds, severity classification, continuous monitoring, auditability, escalation workflows, and clear linkage to governance and control processes. So I think monitoring has to also be contextualized to the institution's use case. It's a different thing, kind of doing risk monitoring on custody or on tokenization or on stablecoins or on payments or treasury operations or market infrastructure. All of them have different risk tolerances and also control requirements. So ultimately, I think supervisory grade monitoring is not about observing the networks. I think it is about generating actionable and defensible risk intelligence that regulators, CROs, auditors, and boards can rely on as part of their enterprise risk oversight.
Oh, thank you very much. So I think it's pretty much about all about the risk, the composability, resilience, or even the supervisory grade monitoring. I think, Nikos, you covered it very well in all spaces. I think the last question from my side is that looking ahead of 12 months, in the next 12 months, what would convince you that the digital asset oversight is starting to mature from the fragmented specialist monitoring and into something closer to a true risk discipline?
Yeah, I think, we are pretty, I would say we're pretty blessed as being, the leading company in this space, in that we have very good visibility into what is going on in our operational risk space. I think what maturity looks like is that financial institutions move beyond kind of the ad hoc risk monitoring towards having standardized key risk indicators, continuous risk assessments instead of like point in time assessments, formal governance processes, board level reporting, which also means that you're integrating into the GRC IRM systems and the supervisory workflows. So that means that you're building the risk infrastructure all the way to the top, right?
Yeah.
And I think digital asset infrastructure is moving in that direction. This is a similar path, one route to what we discussed about cyber risk.
Yeah.
What initially looked like a very niche technical issue gradually, became recognized as a core enterprise and regulatory discipline. So I think we are heading in the same direction. And as we see tokenization scaling, as we see stable coins, through the Genius Act, becoming, growing even more. And we see also blockchain-based financial infrastructure becoming increasingly embedded into the broader financial system. I think we're going to see the standardization, but also the integration of risk into the main enterprise risk framework. So these are to me kind of the two signs of maturity in this space.
Well, thank you very much. All right, I think we cover a lot of the topic on the digital asset risk in those kind of diverse, right? So Nikos, I think thank you for sharing your insight for maybe challenging us to think beyond traditional framework, right? So I think the
Thank
conversation
you.
is
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for allowing me to share also the evolution of our company over the years and
yeah.
how we are creating like the digital asset risk space and building the category up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excited to have a conversation with you. Looking forward to the next
Awesome.
one. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.